So I want to talk about H.G. Wells' The Time Machine in this video. Just a few connections with historical context first that we should be aware of. Wells wrote this, published it in 1895. He was only in his late 20s at the time. This is one of his first novels. He later became known or called the father of science fiction. He wrote things that anticipated everything from, air travel, space travel, nuclear weapons, the kinds of warfare that people fought in the 20th century. He some of his contemporaries or slightly younger people than him, maybe the next generation, hailed him as the person who had the clearest vision of what the 20th century would become before it began. And so he was definitely a kind of futurist visionary, right? And so he's notable in those regards. He, in the Time Machine in particular, he engages with themes that we've discussed when bringing up the historical context. The notion that science can solve all sorts of problems. This is the outgrowth of the scientific revolution and the very positive, optimistic outlook that came from that, right? That we can figure everything out. There are these laws that govern all of the workings of the universe, and once we know those laws, we can manipulate them, perhaps even leading us to be able to travel through time, right? That's the idea here. So this notion of science, this notion of progress, that we are gradually as a species making progress, though he does kind of turn that on its head. I mean, the novel starts that way with this faith in science, faith in progress, but once he travels more than 800,000 years into the future, he realizes where progress, so-called progress, has led humanity, and it's not in a good direction. And this is where we should pick up the other kind of main point of historical context. H.G. Wells was, at least he became over the course of his life, a very committed socialist. He was worried about the problems of the working class, as many people were. Socialism was viewed by many. He's British, living during the late Victorian and kind of Edwardian era. That's when he had his greatest periods of productivity. But both in Britain and the United States and in other Western countries, there was a lot of hand-wringing over the plight of the working class, the inequalities in society. This is all during the Gilded Age or the late Victorian Age. And so that enters into this, and, Wells says, look, these are the serious consequences. This is what this inequality is going to lead to. This is what this division between the capitalists and the laborers is going to lead to. We're eventually going to reach a point where the laborers will rise up and eat the capitalists, right? We'll diverge into two different species. That's how serious this inequality and this division is. So those are, I think, the key points of historical context for understanding the Time Machine. Just to go through some specifics in the text itself. One thing to note here is it was very common, at least among educated elites, people of means anyway, in the Gilded Age and in the Victorian era, to belong to these clubs. Now, we're going to see this also when we view, which is also this week, view the film Metropolis. You'll see that the sons of the elites in Metropolis, in this futuristic city, belong to a club where they, engage in activities together. They have the same entertainments that they follow. They engage, they race each other and wrestle each other, and they go to the same shows and things like that, right? So the time traveler, this character who has no other name in this book, is part of this club, and we have these other characters who are mentioned, some by their profession. You have the psychologist, and some simply by a surname like Philby here, right? And so this whole thing starts out with a meeting of one of these clubs at the home of the time traveler, and he starts to talk about his scientific discoveries. Now, this is early in the stages of the scientific understanding of what's called the space-time continuum. That is, that both space and time are actually, or that they're connected, they are the same thing, and that the laws that govern one govern the other, that as you move at certain speeds through space, that has an effect on time and vice versa, right? And so, this is going to lead to the theories of both the special and general theory of relativity of Albert Einstein, but others were working on these same notions already. And that's where the idea of a time machine comes from. Now, Wells was the one who coined that term, which has been used in science fiction ever since. Any time-traveling story, pretty much every one that I'm acquainted with, involves some kind of time machine that can be used to accomplish this travel, right? And this is described throughout chapter 2 of the book. It looks very much like first he has this model, but then he has like the full time machine. And it's this metal and quartz contraption, okay? Here's the description here at the end of chapter 2. Parts of it were nickel, parts ivory, parts had certainly been filled or sawn out of rock crystal, right? This is similar to a lot of the machines that you find in the Victorian era. If you go to like open air markets in Britain today, you can still find Victorian era contraptions, that people, this was an era of a lot of kind of amateur tinkering with things, invention, using these various materials, especially elites, elite hobbyists who could afford, brass and quartz and rock crystal. They got up to making things out of these things, right? So this is very much in keeping with that kind of, that hobbyist mentality, okay? So anyway, that leads us then to the story of the time travel itself. What does the time traveler find when he goes into the future? Well, initially he doesn't seem to see anything, right? There's no obvious clue when he first arrives 802,701 years in the future that humanity has survived at all. And in fact, he says, he expresses some pessimism. He's sort of like, well, I'm not sure, I was unsure whether we were going to destroy ourselves anyway. This quote right here, what might happen when that hazy curtain was altogether withdrawn, that is, when I finally arrived at this distant future destination, what might have happened to men, that is, human beings. What if cruelty had grown into a common passion? In other words, what if we had simply destroyed ourselves? This was the era that Wells was writing in was certainly an era of a lot of jingoism, a lot of celebration of the possibilities of warfare to conquer and defeat and to rise to the top of this pecking order as it was seen, right? That European countries were in competition with each other and they were preparing for war. The First World War had its roots all through the 19th century, and people didn't anticipate the kind of cataclysm that became. But Wells seems to have some notion that all of this celebration of warfare might lead us to destruction, and that is to some extent what has happened. Although they haven't destroyed themselves, they have instead become, as he says, humanity is at the intellectual of one of our 5-year-old children. Human beings have regressed, in other words, right? They show little initiative. They grow tired quickly. He learns their language quickly because it's so simple. They don't have any intellectual exercises. They don't seem to have really any powers of observation or anything like that, right? He shows up as a curiosity, but they don't, ask him questions about where he came from or what he is or anything like that. They're fascinated when he strikes matches. They clap and cheer and all of this, right? And so they're like little children, okay? And he tries to understand how this happened, and in doing so, this leads him to all sorts of intellectual speculation about the possibilities of human beings, right? He says, maybe it's that we stopped having these challenges. We innovated to the point where we no longer had to worry about a lot of things, and this kind of broke down at the level of the family. We no longer needed. One things he notices about these people he encounters is that there seems to be little distinction between male and female, and he's like, well, this comes from probably a life of ease of some kind, where those distinctions, the kind of the biological distinctions of the strong man and the effeminate woman, have broken down. This is very typical of the kind of Victorian era, mentalities about gender here, right? But it's just obvious that he has found humanity upon the wane here, as he says, right? And there's some positives to this. He comments that there seems to be no disease. The ideal of preventative medicine was attained. Diseases had been stamped out. I saw no evidence of any contagious diseases during all my stay. Moreover, there doesn't seem to be any obvious machinery or anything like that anywhere. But then his time machine gets stolen, right? And he initially kind of goes crazy, but he eventually just accepts that he needs to learn as much as he can about this world and find out where this went, right? And this leads to his most shocking discoveries. One is that the human beings don't seem to have any care for each other. At one point, he finds some of these little humans, bathing somewhere, and this one gets swept away by current, and she's about to drown, and he dives in and saves her, and she becomes his little companion. But none of the others even made a move or even evinced an awareness that she was drowning, right? So they don't seem to have any compassion for each other. That's one of the really kind of dark aspects of this. And so he carries this little woman, girl, whatever, her name is Weena. He carries her with him everywhere he goes. She gets very tired quickly and all of that. And she's also afraid of the dark. And this is one of the strange things to him, right? And it turns out that there are reasons for this, because he catches glimpses of these other creatures who he learns are called Morlocks. And this is where he comes to the realization that human beings have actually differentiated into two species. This is according to the ideas about natural selection pioneered by Charles Darwin and elaborated upon by others. All species will differentiate based on survival of the fittest, which traits allow them to survive from generation to generation. And it turns out that human beings have actually separated into two species, much like the Galapagos finches that Darwin, observed on the Galapagos Islands had done. A common ancestor, but multiple species. The second species is subterranean. They live in the deeps. What he thinks is some kind of ventilation system is actually the tunnels and things that the Morlocks occupy. And this, of course, is where he makes his most shocking discoveries once he travels there and sees that they have that they're carnivores, and he wonders where the meat came from. But then he finally makes the realization that they are eating the Eloi, which are the characters or the humans who live on the surface, right? And so the Eloi, as he says, were mere fatted cattle which the ant-like Morlocks preserved and preyed upon. How did this happen? Well, his supposition is that the Eloi were the elites. They were the capitalists. They were the ones who controlled the means of production. The Morlocks had been the laborers, the ones who were kept in the dark in the factories and did all of the work. Well, eventually it got to the point where the Eloi were so weakened because everybody else did work for them that they lost their ability to kind of think for themselves, and the Morlocks, who at least could maintain machinery and were creative in that way, seized the advantage, and it's reached the point now where they are feeding upon the Eloi. And then this leads him, of course, to try to take desperate measures. He has to find weapons. He somehow finds a box of matches in a kind of museum that's been preserved, which is highly unlikely, of course, but I guess it's a literary convenience for him. There's a really good description late in the book, which I think is indicative of what we might call the dystopian mindset, right? Looking at what humanity has become, this terrible, pessimistic, futuristic vision. He writes, "I grieve to think how brief the dream of the human intellect had been. It had committed suicide. It had set itself steadfastly toward comfort and ease, a balanced society with security and permanency as its watchword. It had attained its hopes to come to this at last." And then he writes, "It is a law of nature we overlook that intellectual versatility is a compensation for change, danger, and trouble. An animal perfectly in harmony with its environment is a perfect mechanism. Nature never appeals to intelligence until habit and instinct are useless. There is no intelligence where there is no change and no need of change. And that's in some ways a commentary on the whole utopian project, right? If we're trying to create a world where human beings live at their ease, well, this is going to take away the need to be intelligent, to solve problems. And we will drift, as Wells said, into feeble prettiness and the underworld to mere mechanical industry, and we will cease to think for ourselves, to use our reasonable capacities to solve problems. When he finally escapes the Morlocks, he gets his time machine back. They try to set a trap for him, but he bests them, and he goes 30 million years in the future. And here he finds the sun is expanding, becoming a red giant, it seems. There are these massive crabs, and this whole idea of humanity really is a distant memory. The humans are gone entirely. Quite pessimistic outlook, right? This, to me, represents what I would like to call the dystopic turn. Now, H.G. Wells did speculate in utopian ways in some of his works. He wrote nonfiction as well as fiction. He was interested in this. He wrote a work in 1905 called A Modern Utopia, for instance, right? Which is kind of alternate history and suggests, the advancements that human beings might make toward a perfected society. But I think he remained pessimistic of that even. And so Wells is a harbinger of things to come. Those who come after him, right after him, are going to be intensely pessimistic about this and see these attempts to perfect the world as falling short and turning into something that is gross and distorted and awful, which is dystopia. All right, thanks.